Perhaps to reduce emotionality, replace slave with serf or peasant, which is appropriate since in practice they were the same thing. One system had a master who owned a slave, the other had a lord who owned land that a serf was bound to work on. Both had a belief that the master or lord would often sleep with his subjects' wives, prima noctis or right of first lie, and nobody had a conniption when the British Broadcasting Corporation does a documentary saying English peasants didn't have it that bad. So it's not unreasonable to think that chattel slavery in the United States would be a similar story, wherein the chattel slaves didn't have it that bad. Today in the United States, height is mainly a function of genetics, as starvation or chronic hunger is freakishly rare. But until the 1900s, chronic hunger and lack of food was a factor in height in the United States, with wealthier populations being visibly taller than poorer ones. Today, blacks are roughly the same height as whites, very slightly shorter actually, and this surprises some people. From the paper A Peculiar Population, the Nutrition, Health, and Mortality of American Slaves from Childhood to Maturity, Richard Streckel compared the height percentiles of black slaves to contemporary white populations at adulthood. And so we can see that in adulthood, black slaves, despite being roughly the same height as whites today, were taller than most whites in the world at the time, with the exception being English aristocrats and Swedes, including people who initially settled Minnesota. Now, how can this be if slaves were as viciously exploited as some may believe? Alienated labor. Robert Evans Jr., in his paper entitled The Economics of American Negro Slavery, calculated the return on capital of slaves in the United States and compared it to money lending and railroads. So we can see that while black slaves had a higher amount of alienated labor than, say, railroad workers, the highest recorded here was 14.8% profit off of their labor. You could speculate it goes up the further back you go. Maybe. There's a linear trend from here, but that doesn't necessarily mean it projects back to 100%, back in 1700 or something. But the reality is that after expenses, black slaves got back, anywhere from 80 to 90% of what they produced on average. And given that the slave plantations were on some of the richest land in the world, the Mississippi River Valley especially, it's not hard to imagine that they were better fed than contemporary whites who, despite getting closer to 100% of what they produced on their land, by working on more marginal land, they ended up having fewer calories for themselves. In the 1870 census, 20.1% of blacks could read and write, compared to 80% of U.S. whites at the time. That same year, Russia, the whole country, had a literacy rate of around 15%. And most African countries didn't achieve a literacy rate of 20% that the blacks had in the U.S. had in 1870 until around 1950. Now, one could argue that U.S. whites should have done more to teach blacks how to read and write, but the idea that their literacy was kept down by the Atlantic slave trade is demonstrably false. Being shipped to the Americas benefited those blacks who were shipped to the Americas in terms of their ability to read and write compared to the population on the continent of Africa. Life expectancy. While black slaves probably grew to be taller than most whites in the U.S., their life expectancy was shorter. Now, it's possible that these are related, as caloric restriction is known to increase longevity. Now, you can look at these as percentages, i.e. what percentage of years do blacks have of whites, but this assumes that improvements in medicine and living standards scale linearly in effect. All we can say with certainty here is that blacks have always lived shorter lives than whites on average. Hours and difficulty of work. John F. Olson, in his analysis of southern cotton farms and northern farms, came to the conclusion that the average free farmer on a northern farm worked 3,130 hours per year, while the black slave worked 2,798 hours per year between 1850 and 1860. Robert Fogel in Time on the Cross claimed that the gang system, which usually included black slaves and a white motivator, was vastly more efficient per hour, saying, quote, "A slave working on an assembly line basis in cotton, sugar, and tobacco, the southern staples, produced as much output in 35 minutes as a traditional worker produced in an hour." So in other words, according to Robert Fogel, while they worked fewer hours, they worked so much harder that it was still worse. However, an analysis by Alan Olmsted and Paul Rode showed that free cotton farms were just as efficient per hour as the touted gang system, and they didn't even count the fact that the motivator wasn't doing any useful work. So blacks worked fewer hours, and there's no evidence that they worked any harder. More recently, in 2015, Trevon Logan did an experiment with his children, saying how much cotton they could pick per day, and compared that to the daily cotton production of slaves at the time, between 1850 and 1860. His results showed that his kids picked about 95% of what the slaves picked on average of the same age between 1850 and 1860. In my opinion, this experiment conclusively shatters the myth of the gang system and the myth that slave labor was uniquely and particularly difficult. Breaking up families. According to The Slave Family, A View from the Slave Narratives by Stephen Crawford, only 51.1% of black families had both parents co-residing. By 1880, this number had increased to around 70%, which is where it stayed until 1940, when it started to decline. By 2011, only 37% of blacks lived in two-parent households, while 75% of whites did. The breaking up families line on slavery was probably more compelling, maybe in 1960 or 1970, when blacks had nuclear families more than 51.1% of the time. Now, I don't know of any statistics on the percentage of black families at the time that were broken up by sale. So we don't know what proportion of the broken up black families during slavery was a result of being split by sale or for some other reasons. I can only find one quantitative record of how often corporal punishment was used, and that is the records of Bennett H. Barrow. The record spans a 23-month period, and over this period he issues 160 whippings, and he had 129 slaves. This averages to about 0.65 whippings per slave per year. However, having read through his records, Barrow seems like a bit of a sadist who enjoyed what he did, and so in my opinion, Barrow is probably not typical, but the system, in fairness, made it so that people like Barrow can have as much power over other people as he did. And that is an unavoidable reality of slavery, and why it's good that white people worldwide abolished it, not only in their countries but around the world. But I am shocked at how difficult it is to find any kind of statistics or data on corporal punishment of slaves during slavery. And you may think that something that is so often referenced in film and in essays and in presentations on other topics, that somebody would have come along and tried to quantify this in some way, but I have not been able to find anything, really, other than the records of a single person who seemed to relish in hurting people. From Thaddeus Russell, A Renegade History of the United States, quote, "Statistics further suggest that rapes were rare on plantations. Most people of mixed race in the South were either slaves who lived in cities, where opportunities for interracial liaisons were greater, or were free. According to the 1860 census, 20% of urban slaves and 39% of free blacks in southern cities were mulattoes. But among rural slaves, who made up 95% of the slave population, only 9.9% were mulatto. Of the slave population as a whole, mulattoes made up only 7.7% in 1850 and 10.4% in 1860. Moreover, only 1.2% of the former slaves interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s reported being raped by a master. Only 5.8% reported hearing about the rape of another slave, and only 4.5% said that one of their parents had been white. According to Fogel and Engerman from Time on the Cross, 1974, all of the available evidence taken together indicates that, quote, share of Negro children fathered by whites on the slave plantations probably averaged between 1 and 2%. Even Fogel and Engerman's most hostile critics concede that it was no more than 8%. There is also evidence of significant numbers of consensual relations between white men and slave women, which would make the percentage of children produced by rape even smaller. The subjective texture of the mind. If you've gone to public schools, these statistics I post here may seem at odds with the subjective texture of vicarious experience, i.e., how you feel slavery was, based on the stories and the narrative presented in public school. And it may seem cliche or ham-fisted that I'm referring to public school here, but this is where the belief came from. This is where and when it formed, is it not? There's a great book called They Were White and They Were Slaves, which is full of personal accounts of a very different world. In fact, a world much more similar to today regarding race and slavery. And here are some examples here, of some quotes. You know, boss, these days there's 3 kinds of people. Lowest down is a layer of white folks. Then in the middle is a layer of colored folks. And on top is the cream, a layer of good white folks. The slaves saw enough abject poverty, disease, and demoralization among the poor whites to see their own condition under old Massa's protection as perhaps not the worst of evils. There's a quote from Eugene Genovese, rather be a nigger than a poor white man. Slave perceptions of Southern yeomen and poor whites in Toward a New View of America. Next quote. When I was a boy, recalled Walters McIntosh, who had been a slave in Sumter, South Carolina, we used to sing, rather be a nigger than a poor white man. Even in slavery, we used to sing that. Gangs of Irish immigrants worked ditching and draining plantation, building levees, and sometimes clearing land of the danger to a valuable Negro slave property. George Templeton Strong, a Whig patrician diarist, considered Irish workmen at his home to have had prehensile paws rather than hands. He denounced the Celtic beast. Irish youths were sometimes called Irish slaves, or more frequently bound boys. A common joke in the South in the pre-Civil War period was that when blacks were ordered to work hard, they complained that their masters were treating them like Irishmen. A slave expressed no surprise that his master, who was a big bruckra, never associated with white trash. And Rosa Stark, who had been owned by a big planter in South Carolina, reported that poor whites had to use the kitchen door when they went up to the big house. Her mistress had a grand manner, no patience for poor white folks. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who designed New York Central Park, observed bales of cotton being thrown from a considerable height into a cargo ship's hold. The men tossing the bales somewhat recklessly into the hold were Negroes, and the men in the hold were Irish. Olmsted inquired about this to a mate on the ship. "Oh," said the mate, "the niggers are worth too much to be risked here. If the patties are knocked overboard or get their backs broke, nobody loses anything." John Randolph of Roanoke, Virginia, traveling in England and Ireland with his black manservant Johnny, wrote to a friend back home, "Much as I was prepared to see misery in the south of Ireland, I was utterly shocked at the condition of the poor peasantry between Limerick and Dublin. Why, Sir John, the slave, never felt so proud of being a Virginia slave. He looked with horror upon the mud hovels and miserable food of the white slaves, and I had no fear of his running away." This is me interjecting here. It's interesting that he referred to those Irish people as white slaves. Now, obviously, this book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, and its quotes, they only tell one side of the story. They're going to give you a one-sided perception of how things were at the time. But that's the whole point. They're giving you that side of the story, that side of the subjective narrative. I'm not saying that these narratives or these quotes or these individual perceptions of history at the time prove me correct. Just as there is an ocean of contemporary narrative that backs up my statistical claims, right? And these narratives portray the United States as having the same crust of, anti-white elites who prefer foreigners to poor white trash. Now, why you have never heard of these kinds of narratives is a whole topic unto itself. Slaves in America would have been slaves in Africa anyway. Based on the fact that 41% of all blacks in West and Central Africa prior to European conquest, okay, this is important, prior to European conquest, were slaves, the extreme increase in price of slaves from the relatively small increase in demand that the Atlantic slave trade represented, and the anecdotal evidence that more slaves were put to work within Africa following Britain's global ban on slavery, we can say that Europeans likely did not cause a single black person to be a slave who wasn't already going to be one, or at least a very small proportion of them. So 1, the population of West and Central Africa from 1500 to 1800. Right? So we can look at the population data on Central and West Africa by year. All right, if you want to read these, you can click on the pause button in the video, or you can click on the link and go to the article and just read the tables themselves. So I'm just going to flash these up here in the video here. And so the populations of West and Central Africa as regions averaged to 31.83 million over the years 1500 to 1800. I'm not bothering to weight it, and it's not going to matter because the magnitude of the case is going to bury any discrepancy between a weighting of this. So just taking an average over all the years is not going to matter that much, as you'll see later. 2, the proportion of slaves in West and Central Africa. Now here is Encyclopedia Britannica's claims for the proportion of slaves in various African states. And I'm going to flash this on the screen in the YouTube video. You can pause it, or if you want to, I would recommend going to the article so you can read it more clearly if you want to read it there. And what we can see, looking at, say, Sokoto, the Fulani Jihad states, and all these other various regions, and these states that approximate to various regions, we see like 1/2, 1/2, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/2, 1/3, 40%, 15% to perhaps 75%, 1/3, 1/2, 1/3, 1/3, 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, 1/2. If the estimates for the proportion of the population that are slaves in all these regions are treated as being precise, with 1/2 being 50%, 1/3 being 33.3 repeating percent, okay, this all averages out to 41.61% of the population of Africa having been slaves between the years that are listed here. So now, if these numbers seem extreme to you, like 41.61%, that seems really, really high. Well, remember that Athens was said to have been about 1/3 slave, and the whole of the Confederate States of America was approximately 1/3 slave. So these are not outrageous numbers for known slave societies. 3, the number of slaves in West and Central Africa. So we have a good idea on what the population of West and Central Africa was, and we have consistent subjective estimates of the proportion of people that were slaves in those regions. The next question is how many people were alive in West and Central Africa from 1500 to 1800. Well, the average year of childbirth in African countries is today around 27. So if we assume that the average was 25 back in 1500 to 1800, then we have a generation time of 25 years, right? And the generation time is the average age at which a person's mother was when they were born. Okay. So there are roughly 382.2 million people who lived in West and Central Africa from 1500 to 1800 doing this equation here. If 41.61% of those were slaves, then this would give us 159 million slaves in West and Central Africa between the years 1500 and 1800. Okay. Atlantic slave disembarkations. Now, roughly 12.5 million slaves disembarked from Africa between 1525 and 1866 to the Americas. Over that same period, we would expect there to have been 484.63 million people to have lived in Africa, And of those, 201.65 million would have been slaves between 1525 and 1866. And so based on this, the Atlantic slave trade was about 5.84% of the total slave trade within West and Central Africa at the time. 5. The inelasticity of supply. Elasticity of supply is a fancy way of saying, does quantity supplied increase in response to an increase in demand? For slaves, if the supply is elastic, that means that the suppliers of slaves can easily supply more slaves if the demand goes up. They can easily go out there and get some more slaves. If it is inelastic, well, that means that suppliers can't very easily get more slaves just because more people are willing to buy them. And if it's perfectly inelastic, that means they can't get any more. That means they have completely maxed out slave production. It doesn't matter how much people are willing to buy a new slave, they just can't get it. They just can't get any more. Okay? That's what perfect inelasticity would mean. Now, if the supply is inelastic, then any increase in demand will simply result in the price of slaves increasing. For example, if the supply of slaves was totally fixed and could not be increased, the new buyers would simply bid out the previous buyers for whom the slaves are now too expensive. And here we can actually compare the price of slaves in Africa. The number of slaves shipped to the Americas in the prior 24 years, roughly a generation time, their price in Africa, and the Atlantic slave trade as a percentage of the overall trade in Central and West Africa. Okay? And I have a table here showing this, and again, I'm going to flash it on the YouTube video, but again, I recommend going to the article to see that table. Now, the extreme increase in price in response to the very small increase in quantity demanded that the Atlantic slave trade represented is evidence that Africans couldn't readily just increase the supply of slaves, i.e., there wasn't much or any, if any, excess supply with which to supply the Europeans. So they would have to either sell some of their slaves they were already using, or pick up arms and go try to enslave some peoples who up to that point had managed to resist enslavement. Now, the price increases are not necessarily entirely caused by the increase in demand over those years. Okay, it's impossible to say with any precision what caused the price increases, but the general pattern seems to indicate extreme price inelasticity, with an 8.293% increase in the relative quantity demanded of slaves, coinciding with a 453.453% increase in price, and then a 0.247 increase in relative quantity demanded, coinciding with a 45.741% increase in price. This indicates extreme inelasticity of supply. Again, there are all sorts of other factors that could be at play that we don't know about. However, the limited data that exists points to extreme price inelasticity, which is evidence of inelasticity of quantity supplied, which is a long way of saying that it looks like the Africans couldn't increase the number of slaves, that the supply was basically fixed, basically maxed out, and as a result, when new buyers came along, what ended up happening was the price of slaves just shot through the roof. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica article, quote, after the limiting and then abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, a number of these African societies put slaves to work in activities such as mining gold and raising peanuts, coconuts, sesame, and millet for the market, close quote. Now, of course, this quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica is not data, but merely a subjective impression, being that the end of the Atlantic slave trade did not result in fewer black slaves. They just stayed in Africa and were put to work doing other things. And when roughly 40% of the population is enslaved and people resist with violence being enslaved, it's certainly not difficult to imagine that the supply of slaves was probably quite inelastic, i.e. very difficult to increase any further. I mean, once you have 40% of the population that's slaves, you're really hitting well, I don't want to speculate as to, point of diminishing returns or the end of low-lying fruit on this, but I think that's what was happening. Our hands are clean. The life of a slave in the Americas was certainly better than the life of a slave in Africa. It's possible that the average non-slave African had a better life than the average slave in the Americas. That's a possibility. But that's not the relevant comparison here. And first off, we don't really even know that to be true, but that's not even the relevant comparison. Because let's say that the Atlantic slave trade did not create a single slave, that it merely moved slaves from Africa to the Americas, who ended up having a better life and a better chance of surviving, even taking into account the Middle Passage. And of course, with the Middle Passage, that's like a one-off event. Like, later generations don't have to deal with that anyway. So, if this is true, would we then say that the Europeans engaged in a wicked act by buying African slaves? Consider that if the Europeans did not engage in this act, those slaves would have remained in Africa, where they would have been more likely to die, where their lives certainly would have been worse. They would have still been slaves. In this case, the Atlantic slave trade improved their lives relative to staying in Africa and remaining a slave in Africa. So whether or not the Atlantic slave trade was immoral is totally dependent on the elasticity of supply. Did the supply of slaves increase in response to the Atlantic slave trade, or was there a relatively fixed supply of slaves that was simply transferred out of Africa? And everything points to no increase in the number of Africans who are slaves, at least not to any quantifiable degree. If there was a slight increase in blacks enslaved, well, it's certainly less than the 12.5 million that disembarked from Africa. And exchange those 12.5 million, had a better chance of surviving, and certainly their progeny had a much better life than those who remained in Africa. Certainly today, like blacks who live in the United States today should be very thankful that their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa or whoever got on that boat. We did not cause them to be slaves, nor was it our duty to buy their freedom. Nobody would be cursing Europeans if they did not buy a single slave from Africa. Yet, if Europeans did not buy a single slave, those Africans would have been worse off remaining in Africa itself. But by doing something that made them better off, right, compared to inaction, which buying them and shipping them to the Americas did, Europeans are then condemned as if we caused their enslavement in the first place. The Africans were slaves to themselves well before we came along. We caused none of it. Only better conditions in the Americas and their eventual freedom. One common claim I hear floating around is that whites benefited from slavery, and that whites are as well off as they are because of the rents extracted from slavery. Different people have different variations of this claim, some claiming more than others. Obviously, the United States is not made out of cotton or tobacco or indigo today. The argument is not that blacks literally built the infrastructure of the United States. Now, if someone is making that argument, that's obviously false, since most rail was in the North and nearly all railroad workers during slavery were white. But the argument is that the profit off of black labor during slavery funded the industrial expansion. Now, we have data about the South, and the black population of all slave states, including those that did not secede, was 26%, or 30.8% of just the Confederacy. Obviously, the Southern economy was itself a dead end, so this argument hinges on the South funding the Northern economy, funding the industrial expansion of the North, since the North was the ultimate engine of the U.S. economy, right? Not the South. Now, I'm not talking about morality or even about the conditions of slaves in this particular article. The topic here is about whether or not whites, on the aggregate, benefited from slavery at the time. And there are two aspects to this. First is the South funding the U.S. industrialization argument, the idea that Southern, that slavery, the profits from slavery funded industrial expansion elsewhere, that argument. And the second is about the direct expropriation of labor, right? How much did whites get directly from black slaves versus what they would have gotten investing in other things, investing in things other than slavery, okay? So, one is the South funding U.S. industrialization. Now, the interesting thing here is that northern agriculture was more valuable than southern agriculture. In 1860, 65% of all United States farm acreage was in the north. Now, it's possible that northern farm production was less than 65% of the value of what was produced, or even less than 50%, and that the South, even though it only had 35% of the used farmland, produced more money with its agriculture than what the North did with their agriculture. But there are reasons to not believe this. First are the overall values of farm products produced in the year 1860. Okay, and so this will be a chart flashed on the YouTube video. You can go look at the article itself if you want to see it more clearly. Now, the combined production of hay and potatoes gives King Cotton a run for its money. But the real value of U.S. farm production in 1860 was cereals. Now, I don't know what percentage of farms in the North and South produce cereals, but I do know that the farms in the North were more geared towards cereal production, wheat, oats, barley, corn, than the South was. Okay. And we also know that farmland in the North cost more per acre. According to Peter Lindert's study on farm prices in the paper entitled Long Run Trends in American Farmland Values, and again, another table here, which you can look in the video. You can pause the video, look at it, or go to the article to see more clearly. And looking at this table, we can see that there are lots of reasons that land would cost more in the north. I'm not saying that the additional cost was entirely a function of the northern land having additional yield, that northern agriculture being better per acre. But the fact that it did cost more per acre than land in the south did makes the idea that southern agriculture was in aggregate more valuable than northern agriculture seem unlikely. Okay, if each acre in the north costs more than each acre in the south, it makes the idea that total southern agricultural production was higher by value than total northern agricultural production. All that is becoming an increasingly unlikely proposition. Or at least it shows that there's no obvious reason to believe that southern agriculture would be more valuable, right? Just based on the farm acreage and based on the value of total agricultural production, just looking at this, our best estimate would be that northern agriculture was 65% of the agricultural value, southern agriculture was 35%, right? Just going with the farm acreage would, seems to be like the safest estimate here. And so if slavery was such enormously profitable exploitation, why wasn't land in slave states more valuable? Okay, the next thing. 1b. The tariff was disproportionately paid by the North. Now, a table from The Rise of the New York Port by Robert Greenhalgh looked at the percentage of imports that were paid by the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. And another table here that you can go check out or pause the video. Now, the fact that 80+% of all imports are going through these states each year, right? New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, doesn't necessarily mean that they're paying 80+% of the tariffs, but it probably does, okay? And also in the year 1859, we know that the Port of New York paid roughly 76.67% of all tariffs in the United States. So for that 1 year, the imports roughly matched the tariffs paid. And there's no reason to expect that, barring minor fluctuations by year, the percent amount a state pays in tariffs is going to be about the same as the percent of all imports going through that state. Right? It just kind of makes sense on that. Now, Andy Hall looked at the highest tariff revenues on selected ports in the United States in the fiscal year 1859 and listed off some of the revenues of various ports. And there's a table there that you can go check out. And he also made a very interesting visualization that I'll put up in the video. Now, in the case of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, this appears to match what we know about the percent of goods imported through those ports. Now, the keen observer will see that these are tariffs paid by ports. This doesn't necessarily mean that the quote-unquote real cost of the tariff was paid by the North, as it is possible that these goods arrived in northern ports where the tariff was paid, but then that cost was passed on to the southern farmers, right? Which is why, before I did this, I pointed out that northern agriculture is, by all indicators, bigger than southern agriculture. And according to the National Park Service, the North had twice as much machinery per acre as the South did. All right, which would translate to 78.79% of all agricultural machinery being in the North, if we just do the math. So even if we presume that farmers were hit harder by the tariff because it increased the cost of industrial farm machinery, either through having to pay tariffs on the imported machinery or having to buy more expensive domestically produced machinery, on that, a disproportionate amount would be paid by the North anyway, because they bought not only most of the farm machinery, but a greater proportion of farm machinery given the total amount of acreage in the North, right? So no, the North was going to be paying slightly more than 80% of the tariff directly, and they used slightly less than 80% of all agricultural machinery, so they were going to get roughly 80% of the indirect costs as well. So the North was paying around 80% of the tariff in both direct and indirect cost. The South was not paying the lion's share of the tariff, and slave labor produced perhaps 1/3 of what the South was paying based on the population of slaves anyway. And one last argument, kind of a tangential argument, is that a disproportionate amount of federal infrastructure funds went to the South. Not that it matters that much, since federal spending in 1860 was $78 million, while the GDP at the time was roughly $4.387 billion. Federal spending amounted to 1.78% of GDP in 1860. Now, for what it's worth, 42% of all federal infrastructure spending went to the South between 1800 and 1860. All right, and I have a link there. It's table 5 in that link. So yeah, the federal government, so as it happens, no, the federal government was spending almost half, was spending 42%, a disproportionate amount of federal infrastructure funds were going to the South. So if anything, the North, which was paying the bulk of the tariffs, money was being siphoned from the North to fund the infrastructure developments of the South. But the hell of it is, like, this is such a tiny amount, right? So it's a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall federal budget, and in the federal budget, which itself was a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall economy. So who cares? The South didn't need slaves to grow cotton. And so we can see that the South did not build the United States. It did not fund the industrial expansion of the North. If anything, it probably slightly went the other way. And since the argument for a big white benefit from slavery requires the South paying for the development of the United States overall, i.e. the North, this makes the idea that blacks in the South paid for it through their labor basically impossible. And the idea that it was paid for by specifically the labor of black slaves even more impossible on top of that. Basically twice again as impossible. So the next question is, how much did whites benefit from having black slaves instead of having to negotiate a wage with like a white person? Well, that's difficult to tell, but we do have rough estimates for the return on investments for slaves compared to railroads and short-term, like 90-day to 180-day loans. And this gives us a rough idea of how profitable slaves were compared to the rest of the economy. And I'll have another table on here comparing the average profit rate on various investments. And I think it's worth reading off here. So Boston Rails had an average profit rate of 8.6%, Southern Rails 8.5%. Okay. Short-term money 9.6%, All Rail 7.16%, and Rail Bond 7.6%. I'm not quite sure what the difference between a rail bond and All Rail is, but apparently it's a different thing. Slaves 12.61%. Okay, now let's not sneeze at this. An average profit of 12.61% would be amazing today. But remember, profits were higher back then than they are today. There were probably specific investments at the time that paid off better than slaves, but there was probably no class of investments that was more profitable than slavery. But 12.61% profit, okay, well that means 87.39% not profit. It means roughly 87.39% of what a slave was producing was going back into feeding, clothing, and sheltering the slaves, as well as paying for whatever was needed for him to continue working. But what if the South didn't have slaves? Could they grow cotton without slaves? And the answer is a resounding yes. And I'll have another table here showing cotton production in the South by year, and you can see the table there on the video or on the article itself. And between 1861 and 1865, that's the Civil War, so there's no data there. But we can see that cotton production collapsed after the Civil War. No big surprise. Now, it's hard to tell exactly due to annual fluctuations. You can go read the original source material I'm using to see what I'm talking about. But it seems that cotton production matched its pre-war peak around 1871 and then continued to go up from there. So yes, cotton could be produced without slaves. It shouldn't be too hard to believe since most white Southerners were farmers. And most of the farmers in the United States at the time were white, and they produced a net food surplus. And as pointed out in other articles, there were free white farms that produced cotton. Opportunity denied. In 1860, slaves were 12.67% of the U.S. population. Now, while some whites gained from that sweet 12.61% profit off of his slaves, the average profit for investment in the economy at large was around 8.5% anyway. So we're talking between a 4 and 5% higher profit that people who invested in slaves got compared to what they would have gotten if they invested somewhere else. Okay, this right here, this is what some whites got from slavery. I don't know exactly how many, but some fraction of whites, some thin slice of whites that owned slaves got 4.4 to 5% more profit than they would have gotten without slaves. Okay? That's it right here. But because of these high profits, a certain amount of investments that could have been used on, say, railroads or shoe factories or something good were instead used on more slave plantations. Now, this did two things. One, it diverted Southern investments into short-term profits of slavery instead of the long-term profits of industry. Because let's say you build a shoe factory, right? That factory has a bunch of machines to work the leather and buckles and stuff, right? You don't have plastics or synthetics, right? And that machinery needs people who know how to work it. It requires iron, it requires steel, it requires lubricants. And iron and steel, of course, is an industry in itself that requires coal and some other stuff, I think. Basically, now you have a machine tools industry. Now that you've started making them, well, machine tools in general become cheaper, and you can use those for other things, creating investment opportunities in textiles or in metal teapots and kettles and coaches and steam engines. A plantation has no such expansion effects. Okay, you're just buying a bunch of people and saying work, they produce stuff, and you get some cash, right? It doesn't go anywhere. Like, it doesn't. I mean, the profits may in fact be higher than an investment in industry, but the investment in industry, you have all these mechanical stuff that needs to be produced. Right, and there's this is what I believe the term is called a gateway industry, or versus gateway industries versus dead end industry. And one of the common examples of this is comparing Portugal and their wine industry versus England and their textiles industry. The wine industry was actually profitable for Portugal in the short run, but in the long run, the textiles industry was better because when you had textiles, you now had a machine tools industry, which made it easier to invest in a whole bunch of other stuff, and it made it easier to mechanize your agriculture and a whole bunch of stuff from there. This is why the North exploded and the South stagnated, right? Because the North invested in a bunch of things that may not have had as high of a profit rate, but had better long-term economic effects, right? Than just the cash crops. Now, I'm not blaming black slaves for what happened to the South. and why the South was so much poorer than the North. Okay, they didn't do anything. They couldn't do anything, but it is merely to say that whites would certainly have gone more in an industrial direction in the South if they didn't have slaves. And this is not, first off, I'm not alone in this speculation, and it's hypothesized that Rome would have industrialized if it didn't have slaves. And also, the South shifted more towards industrial developments following the end of slavery. So this is somewhat speculative, but it's not that speculative. The second thing that it did, it diverted Southern investments away from things that employed white workers and toward things that, quote unquote, employed black slaves. Now, any white who didn't own slaves was made poorer by the fact that other whites did, because investments were diverted from, say, railroads, which would have employed white workers, and were instead diverted to slave plantations, which employed black workers. Okay. Now, whether the total dollar value of the short-term extra profit, again 4 to 5%, that some whites got from slaves instead of the other investments outweighs the effects it had in directing the South down a long-run economic dead end of being an agriculture, a resource-based economy, and the immediate impact denying the white working class in the South better employment opportunities, does that outweigh that 4.4 to 5% better profit, like for a few slave owners in short run calculations? I don't know for sure, but intuitively I think it absolutely made whites worse off, especially in the South. It certainly made working class whites worse off. I don't think that's really debatable. And it may have even ultimately been worse for the investing class of whites, who may have ultimately had higher profits in about 20 years if they invested in factories. Because sure, okay, that factory, it only has like a 6% profit, whereas you can buy some slaves and get a 12% return on your investment. But if everyone's investing in factories, that's going to raise standard of living, and that's going to make it easier to invest in other things, and just your material life improves more than if everyone just invested in a bunch of slaves. Because you invest in a bunch of slaves, okay, now you have a bunch of people working on farms. That doesn't go anywhere. I mean, you could work on a farm, right? You're not mechanizing. I mean, buying slaves to work on a farm, that's what people did in the year 1000 AD, right? You're not, there's no growth from that. That's just shuffling around labor. That's just shuffling around labor resources. That's not, okay, I'm repeating myself. So in conclusion, now if you think this is radical or unbelievable, consider where your beliefs about slavery came from. They came from textbooks in middle school taught by a teacher who has to teach 50 other topics. So the time and place where core beliefs about slavery are formed are being conveyed by a teacher who is hopelessly overstretched on too many topics. And this is another topic, but what teachers teach in middle school and then high school is not necessarily where the field is at currently. Certainly high schools aren't comparing the profitability of slavery to railroads. Okay, they're not quantifying anything. Right? They're just pushing narrative. And as seen in They Were White and They Were Slaves, the current general narrative, based on anecdotes and stories, is itself cherry-picked. That was the point of bringing that up. Not that those anecdotes and those personal accounts of the time are, necessarily representative of the time. Right? I don't deal in that. I don't deal in stories and personal experiences. That's stupid. Okay? But what I'm saying is that there is a plethora of anecdotes and stories which go along with the data that I'm presenting in this video. Okay, so even in terms of just weaving a narrative based on personal accounts and storytelling, even in that they're cherry picking narrative and storytelling that paints slavery in the most brutal and kind of surreal fashion. And the studies I'm citing here in this video that you're watching, they come from the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s. This is long, long after, like, the narrative has been established. This research, this historical economic research, has been done mostly long after, you know, the pageant, the sort of civic religion about slavery, as being, you know, inhumanly cruel and sadistic and brutal exploitation, right, has already been mythologized and has already been set. So basically, the narrative was set before the real empirical research was ever done. Right? That's the hell of it. And so you can say, well, the thing is, people have believed this for such a long time, and all the schools are saying this, and like the history people are all the history. First off, I don't history profession. I think is kind of a joke, but that's another topic. But like, it seems kind of difficult to sort of swallow that all of that has been wrong from top to bottom for so long. But you have to consider that the narrative was set before the research was done. Okay? The narrative was set before the research was done. Okay? So that's just a way to look at this.